So we talked the first part of the semester about control and this idea of how humans really want control over stuff in their lives. So one particular day, my professor was hitting us really hard. He was being really deep, and I was sitting there like, what are you saying? But he was talking about how humans crave control, and we're seeing this in some of the characters that we were reading about. So he's talking about how humans as a whole want control, and he brings up this interesting struggle about how everybody centers their life on trying to find control over stuff, but then as you try and put all this effort into trying to get control, you find that you can't get it. I realized that I knew the answer to this problem, and that Jesus was the answer to something that my secular professor was saying. And I didn't have to be depressed about wanting control and not being able to get it, because I knew the truth that God was the one in control, and it wasn't up to me to make my life worthwhile. But I was thinking about all the other students in my class, and that if they were really putting thought into what my professor was saying, they probably felt really meaningless and really powerless and probably pretty helpless, because my professor is telling us that the one thing that you're going for, you can't get. I'm going to have a two-part phrase today, and this is the first phrase that the Lord has really taught me this year, and that's the fact that Jesus is relevant. He is relevant to the real world. People who are not Christians have questions that Jesus is the answer to. And before I went to college, I think that my brain thought that Jesus fit very nicely into this religion section of society. I would believe everything that I heard here, and I knew about him, but I don't think I thought he was as helpful in what we call the real world. And I have a feeling that we probably all tend to do that. We separate our God lives from our other lives that we call the real world. So Jesus is great at Westminster, and I believe everything that I'm learning here, but he doesn't really affect how I process my music and my movies and everything else in here in the world. It's just kind of separate. But what I have learned this year from going to a non-Christian college is that Jesus is very, very relevant. He relates very much to our culture. So today we're going to talk about a guy who was probably close to our age when his life got completely wrecked, and his name is Meshach. So Meshach, or Mishael, which is his original Hebrew name, was just living his normal life in Israel when Babylon, really powerful, really scary enemy, comes and invades Israel. So the Babylons, they come in with their army and they're destroying everything, and they see Meshach and his friends, and they're like, hey, you're talented, you're basically good at life, so we think you could help our nation in the future. So they take him and his friends, they drag them away from their families, and they yank them off to Babylon, which is a good 2-week walk away from his home country. So when the Babylonians invaded other nations, obviously they would use their army, they would use traditional means of war that we're used to hearing about, but they would also use cultural destruction, where they would take the young men, the best young men of that nation, who were going to be the leaders, who were going to carry on the traditions of that country, and they would completely absorb them into the Babylonian culture, doing their best to kill off their home culture. So Babylon's goal was to remove every trace of Hebrew culture from Meshach and his friends, making them as Babylonian as possible, hence they changed his name to Meshach. Meshach is being hit from all sides with this culture that wants to completely consume him. He could have caved, he could have gone along, with exactly what everybody wanted him to do, but he and his friends put their feet down and decided to stand up for the Lord. Our world also wants to make you and me as little minions that are completely caught up in everything that the world tells us. The world wants to change our names, teach us the language and literature of Babylon, and keep us from passing on the things of God to the next generation. But I'm sure you hear a lot from speakers, our culture does this, and our culture does this, but what are the things that our culture is made of? If we don't know what the world's trying to force us to believe, then how are we ever going to be, fighting against it? So we're going to talk about 4 things quickly that identify our culture that the world is feeding you these lies. The first is entitlement. The world tells you deserve whatever you want. You're entitled to the great things of life, and you shouldn't ever really have it bad because you're entitled to a good life. Secondly, selfishness. The world tells you that it's all about you, it's all about accomplishing your goals, and no matter how many people you have to step on to get what you want, it's all about you. Thirdly, independence. The world tells you that you don't need anybody to help you through life, that you are weak if you depend on a higher power, and that religion is just this crutch that people use to make them feel better, make themselves feel better. And fourthly, hypocrisy. The world tells you that you can totally be religious, and then you can have fun too. That it's okay for you to put on your little Sunday morning hat and then look exactly like the rest of the world the rest of the week. But, okay, if Jesus is only helpful in our little Sunday morning box, then how are we ever going to defend ourselves against these 4 things and the other, millions of lies that we're getting? If Jesus doesn't relate to our songs, for example, that tell us to live it up because you deserve it, then we're going to become complete Babylonians without even trying. It will literally take no effort on our part. We'll just be fed all these lies, and we're going to become completely like everyone else. And if Jesus is only good in a section of our lives, then we are going to end up living two lives. Our God life over here, and then our other life over here that is completely caught up and bought into everything that the world says. But this brings you back to the point that I referenced earlier. Thank goodness Jesus is relevant. Jesus is the thing that connects those two worlds, because the two worlds that we make up in our heads are actually one thing. Jesus is the real world. Spiritual things are real life. They're more real than any of the lives we're getting in the world. Jesus matters very, very much. He is crucial to being able to survive in this world that's telling us it's all about you. You have to compete with other people to be valuable. You know, you're only important if you look a certain way. You're only important if you have certain talents, and tons of other things that the world is telling you that's opposite of what Jesus says. Jesus is crucial to surviving in this world. But look how relevant God was to Meshach. Meshach was living in a real-life culture that wanted to completely take God out of his life and had no regard for God at all. But when Meshach chose God's way, God gave him success in that very culture. Like, do you realize that Meshach wasn't being rewarded in a religious environment? He wasn't in Sunday school getting the award for being the perfect little kid. He was in a secular culture, and God gave him success. The verse we read earlier said that God gave Meshach and his friends knowledge that was 10 times better than any of the other wise men in Babylon. I've been doing a Beth Moore Bible study on Daniel, which is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it today. And she writes this awesome quote about the story that I wanted to read to y'all. We've read the language of their culture with the lens of God, talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Thereby, they became culturally relevant without becoming spiritually irrelevant. Against all odds, they retained a God-centered worldview so that ultimately the world could view their God. Jesus is relevant. Okay, but now we have to ask the question, if Jesus is so relevant, then how are we supposed to live like he's relevant? Because if we just say, great, Jesus matters to the real world, then nothing about our lives is going to change. We're going to keep living like Jesus should stay in his little religion box and everything else is separate. The way that we live like Jesus is relevant is to live like Jesus. It's cliche, you've heard it before, but it's the only way that his relevance is going to show up in our lives. It's literally the only way. So how are we supposed to live? What about Jesus are we supposed to be going for? Like, what's our goal here? We're going to get that answer from 1 Peter 1, verses 14 through 16, which say, as obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. So the second phrase I'm going to leave with you today, first of all, being Jesus is relevant, is that holiness is required. Meshach and his friends, first of all, they got that God was relevant because he gave them success in a secular culture. They knew exactly that spiritual life and real life was integrated. But they also knew that they desperately needed to be holy. We can look back at the food issue. Daniel 1 verse 8, the first part of it says that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food or wine. These 4 guys made up their minds to be holy in what they ate based on what God had commanded them at that time. And, this food had probably been offered to Babylonian idols, which was why it was not okay for them to eat it, which seems like a small issue. But God doesn't tell us to just not do the really big bad things. Like, he tells us to be holy, which means we're supposed to be set apart, we're supposed to be different, and we're supposed to keep perfection as our standard. So Meshach continues to pursue holiness even after this food issue with the king. A few years later, Meshach and his guys are still in Babylon, dealing with the same king, the same culture that wanted to make them forget about God. And this king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is probably the ultimate example of the Babylonian culture. He's proud, he is so self-absorbed that he creates this massive gold statue and tells everyone to bow down to it or die by being burned alive. So Meshach could have said, okay, I've already stood up to this guy once, and okay, yes, the Lord gave me the wisdom I needed, which was great, but I am really tired of being so different, so this time I think I'm just going to blend in, and oh yeah, I'd really rather not die by fire. I think I'm just going to slide by this time. But we probably wouldn't have blamed him, and that's probably the easy route. Like, he's had a rough life by now, but he and his friends stood up alone when everyone else bowed down to this statue. They knew that idolatry was not an option, and just like the king said, they were dragged off to the fiery furnace, which was so hot that it killed their guards, by the way, which is just a little terrifying. But he and his friends say to the king in Daniel 3, 17 through 18, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Meshach knew his calling was perfection. He was absolutely not going to bow down to that idol. And y'all know the rest of the story. They were thrown into the fiery furnace, and God rescues them from it. He brings them out not even smelling like smoke. Jesus is relevant, and so holiness is required. So as we finish up, let's talk about this holiness is, and it's just a little bit more. I'm going to read 1 Peter 2, verse 9, talking about Christians, believers, followers of Jesus. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that, why are we holy? So that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So why are we supposed to be holy? We're not supposed to be holy because God takes delight in making us follow 100 million rules. We're supposed to be holy because it's the best way to share Jesus. I can hear your questions though, but Haley, don't I need to fit in to be the best witness possible? And I hate to break it to you, but actually no. God doesn't tell us to fit in. Be perfect? Yeah. Copy Jesus? Yeah. Be different? Yeah. But fit in and look exactly like the world? No. We probably think, Haley, that sounds so stuck up. That is really annoying and goody two-shoes, and I really just don't want to be like that. And I understand it does sound like that, but if we are executing holiness the way it is designed, it is the opposite of that. Holiness is absolutely not prideful. Holiness is humble. Holiness loves people. Holiness serves people, because that's what Jesus did, and that's what we're going for. So our whole problem with this idea of holiness is that, frankly, we're just not willing to be weird for a God that died for us. I know I often say to the Lord, thank you for the cross and all, it's great, but I'm just going to go over here and listen to this song with a bunch of bad words in it, but thanks though. What am I thinking? The gospel is so amazing and so unbelievable because it's a terrible deal. It is a terrible deal on God's part. He gives everything for me, and he gets me in return. What kind of a deal is that? He really gets thrown into the deal there. But he made it that way because he loves us that much. So in light of that gospel, we are old enough to start figuring out what we think is worth it in life. We can think about what life is about. We all have brains. We can think about what life is about. We can think about what we're supposed to do with this Jesus. It is up to you to decide when you get to college what life is about. And I learned that firsthand this year, that no one tells you that Jesus is the answer. No one tells you to go to church. No one tells you to read your Bible. No one is telling you every single day that this is what life is about. That's one of the blessings of being here. But when you leave and go to a Christian school, when you leave a Christian school and go to a non-Christian school, no one is going to be telling you that. But Jesus is the answer to every single day of life. But he is telling us to be holy just like he is. Being a follower of Jesus is supposed to radically change our lives, not just be something to tack onto our resume. We don't, make our little list of qualities and be like, I am an athlete, I am a student, I play this instrument, and oh yeah, by the way, I'm a Christian. It's supposed to radically change every single area of our lives. Might blow your brains out a little bit here, but Jesus never in the Bible asks you to give up your Sunday mornings. He just doesn't. He asks you to kill your natural desires. He asks us to give up the things that our sinful hearts desperately want to do. Literally, every single time I do something, say something, listen to a song, watch a movie, I should be asking myself if Jesus would do it, because that is what he asks me to do. As a believer, I am called to holiness and to perfection, not to blending in. Jesus is so relevant to our culture, and so holiness is required. And even though working toward holiness means that we'll probably have to sacrifice, Jesus is so worth it. He is so worth it. He makes the sacrifices look tiny. He is, oh my word, he is 100% what life is about. Life is worthless without him. Absolutely worthless. It literally doesn't make sense. When I've learned this year being in classes that are teaching it from a non-Christian perspective about human nature, about why wars break out, about, everything that's going on in our world, it doesn't make sense if Jesus isn't at the root of it. He is the center of history, secular history and biblical history, all of history. He is the rock that everything is built on, and he is our relentless Redeemer who pursued us when we were disgusting and gave up everything just so that we could have a relationship with our Creator. Pursuing holiness is worth it because he is such a wonderful Savior. So pursue holiness this summer and as you continue your walk of faith.